want to turn to some interesting perspective here on a big topic that is really sweeping the nation as far as interest. And this is regarding the deportations that we've been seeing to El Salvador. So for folks who have been keeping up with some of the challenges, by challenges I mean legal challenges to actions from the Trump administration, you know that this has been ongoing for quite some time. One of the big cases that we saw with some developments just today involved the president's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, and we just saw a judge weighing in on that case, saying that there is a threat here of them actually going ahead and issuing criminal contempt orders regarding some of these deportations and flights that were sent to El Salvador, with folks being deported here and brought to prisons. And there have been some concerns from folks on the side of legal teams representing a plaintiff in this case about due process and whether folks are being given a fair, shake to explain themselves before they are sent overseas. Separately from that, there is a different court case which folks have been paying close attention to nationwide, and that is the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He is the man who is from Maryland, who was sent mistakenly to El Salvador recently. And throughout various court processes, we've arrived to this point now where the Supreme Court has weighed in on an order basically saying that the U.S. must bring this man back to the United States. You might recall not too long ago, the President Donald Trump, sitting down with the president of El Salvador, and essentially the president of El Salvador saying, we're not going to send this man back. And the judge who issued this order saying, bring Abrego Garcia back to the U.S., is saying that she's been asking for information from the Trump administration, basically asking to be shown what steps are you taking to make this happen. And essentially she's saying that she hasn't heard anything. Related to this, we should mention, too, there's a senator from Maryland who apparently just landed today in El Salvador, and he intends to try to see Abrego Garcia in person and just get a look at his condition, because we know that folks who are being held in the specific El Salvador prison are being held incommunicado, which means that they are not allowed to have contact with the outside world. So there are still a lot of question marks about the condition of Abrego Garcia, as well as, of course, what his ultimate fate will be if he's able to be brought back to the U.S. Nevertheless, here, wanted to sit down with a political and legal expert to kind of get some insight on what the courts could do potentially if there are no moves by the Trump administration to bring this man back to the U.S. Are there ways, are there channels or outlets that they can use to try to force this into happening? So take a listen now. We have some of my snippet here with Dr. Michael Bitzer, a professor with Catawba College, weighing in on that. We're here to talk about the developments surrounding Kilmar Abrego Garcia. This was the man from Maryland who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador, is being held in a prison there. And we haven't really seen a lot of movement lately to try to get him back here to the United States, despite a Supreme Court decision basically siding with orders that he be brought back to the U.S. We have Dr. Michael Bitzer here, professor of political science with Catawba College. So we wanted to talk about, really at this point, how the courts would go ahead and enforce this to be done, given that we haven't really seen any, as we mentioned, outward movement to try to comply with the orders.
Correct. And this would be ultimately up to the judge that is overseeing this particular case. The U.S. Supreme Court gave the judge the authority to facilitate the return. She has been questioning government lawyers as to how this process is going to unfold. I think that there's some honest stonewalling going on by the government in this particular case. And so now the question becomes, what can a judge do to compel the government to be able to bring this person back to the United States? I think, there are a variety of things, but the main thing most of us are watching is, will the judge hold the government or government officials in civil contempt, meaning that she could potentially impose fines and or potentially ask for individuals to be jailed. This is bordering on a real constitutional question regarding the power of the courts versus the power of the executive branch.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up just now the fact that a lot of folks are not only honed in on this situation itself with this gentleman from Maryland, but also the fact that this could have potential implications on, basically how our government as we know it is set up to run as far as checks and balances. So you'd mentioned this potential of civil contempt that's being weighed. How does that work? And are there any caveats to this actually playing out?
Right. Well, we have seen in the past judges hold government officials in contempt, hold the government actually in contempt, hold departments, agencies have been held in contempt by previous judges. I think where we are pushing up against the line in terms of a real constitutional issue at hand is, will the other side, the executive branch, recognize and respect the power of the courts? And I think this is where the real question lies. If a judge was to issue a civil contempt against a government official, the judge would have to utilize federal marshals to execute that particular contempt order. And federal marshals fall under the power of the Department of Justice, which is an executive branch agency, but they have been recognized as carrying out the law as determined by the judicial branch. Now, the judicial branch could also utilize a third party to try and execute and enforce this civil contempt. I hope that we do not get to that point in time, but this is raising real issues of whether we are a rule of law based government or a rule by men based government. And our Constitution is clearly designed to be a rule of law system.
Just have so many questions, as we get down the chain of processes, because you mentioned the marshals, and that's DOJ, and of course we have the person who is heading up that department, an appointee, of course, of the president. So if let's just say marshals don't decide that they're going to comply with this, or there's some way that gets the kibosh, like, what then? What happens after that?
Well, a judge could certainly pursue perhaps a third party, maybe call upon local law enforcement that would not be under the jurisdiction of the federal government and the executive branch to carry out the civil contempt. We're in kind of some entering potentially dangerous waters. I hope that it doesn't get to this point. There will probably be most likely appeals of any contempt order that is imposed, and that could work its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the U.S. Supreme Court in 1911 made it very clear that the power to issue contempt orders and the power to enforce judicial orders is something that is inherently a component of judicial power in this country. And if individuals choose to ignore or to try and circumvent those judicial orders, the question then becomes, do we recognize the power of the U.S. Constitution and the power of the rule of law? I think, we've got a ways to go in all of this, but this is setting up for a potential true constitutional battle and crisis if there is, willingly disregarding a judicial order or an attempt to enforce a judicial order.
Well, clearly, if there is this, you mentioned the 1911 ruling, there is some precedent here for this being maybe questioned, or I'm just kind of curious, in the historical context, when else have we seen this issue come up before?
I think the most prominent one related to ultimately the power of the presidency is the Nixon tapes back during the Watergate event. President Nixon refused to hand over tapes from the Oval Office to both a special prosecutor and ultimately to a Senate committee investigating the Watergate break-in. And that case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court and basically said, in certain circumstances, the president does have the ability to withhold material from the judiciary, but in this kind of situation, it is not the power of the president to ignore a court ruling. And basically what happened was public opinion sided with the court against Nixon, and ultimately he had to resign. I think we are seeing a replay of that mentality of whatever the president says is the law of the land. And that is very dangerous territory for a democratic republic.
Do you think that in this case, public opinion would make a difference? Because I mean, we've been seeing, obviously, more on the Democratic side, because we know there's the senator from Maryland who's now traveled to El Salvador to try to get some answers. But I mean, do you think that that would make a difference if we hear more people speaking up from outside of the administration, or maybe even within the administration, about this case?
I think certainly public pressure and public opinion can weigh some power on the presidency and on the president, but we are in very divided partisan times. We are highly polarized, and the likelihood is public opinion, while it may be against the president, it will not be in overwhelming numbers. It will probably be very tight in terms of who disagrees with the president versus who agrees with the president. And for the most part, what we have seen is public opinion on the Republican side stand firmly behind President Trump. Those who identify as Democrats tend to be in lockstep opposition. And those folks in the middle, the independents, will have to see where they fall in terms of this and if it gets the kind of notoriety that calls into question our system of government.
Yeah, very interesting times, and obviously topic for so many folks who are really, really focused on this issue for all of its implications. Dr. Michael Bitzer, we really appreciate your time as always and your insights. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Right, so we were hearing there live Impact News on WCNC Plus, my earlier sit down with Dr. Michael Bitzer, political science professor with Catawba College, really giving some interesting perspective to one of the big topics that we're seeing in national headlines, and that is the deportation efforts that have been underway by the Trump administration and some of the challenges that these efforts have been seeing in the court system. Just to kind of recap a bit more on this Kilmar Abrego Garcia case, we mentioned, of course, that as of last check, the judge in this case, the one who had issued this order saying he must be brought back to the United States, we haven't, apparently, according to this judge, have not heard any response from the Trump administration on any specific steps that they would be taking to try to make this happen. We heard, in that sit down with President Trump and the president of El Salvador, saying, that would be preposterous for us to return this man. We've been seeing, folks within the Trump administration, for example, White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller saying he is a citizen of El Salvador. How arrogant for folks to suggest that we would tell El Salvador how to handle their citizens and to return him by extension, is, his statement there. However, we're seeing the courts here saying, this was improperly done, in some perspectives. Mr. Abrego Garcia, from what we understand, had an order that was actually keeping him here in the United States. He was seeking asylum from El Salvador, and apparently, some of that stems from his family's background, because we've seen various reporting out there talking about how his father was a police officer in El Salvador, and so they truly thought that there would be retaliation or potential for gang violence against Abrego Garcia if he ever did return to El Salvador. And of course, now he is there, and he is in a prison being held amongst, what were understanding are, gang members who are being imprisoned there as well, MS-13, et cetera. So this is definitely a situation, as you heard Dr. Bitzer saying, even if we see more movement, on the court side, the legal side, in the short term, this might be playing out long term with the potential for various legal challenges. Keep in mind, as we mentioned, we heard Dr. Bitzer specifically honing in on civil contempt. It is important to note with the criminal contempt developments that we talked about, just a few moments ago, where the judge specifically weighing in on the Alien Enemies Act, the use of that rarely used wartime law. The judge in that case, specifically weighing in on the use of that to deport folks to El Salvador, threatening criminal contempt. That is, somewhat of a different situation from civil contempt. And it does sound like, the charges would inevitably, in that situation, if they went with contempt, would have to come from DOJ, which, as we pointed out, in the sit down with Dr. Bitzer, of course, under the president, ultimately as is a department where he is appointed the head of DOJ. However, we've heard the judge in that specific case saying that he would try to seek a prosecutor who is outside the realm of DOJ to try to pursue this if necessary.